Hello, and welcome to today's virtual program of the Commonwealth Club of California. I am Brad Berman, your host for today's presentation. It is my pleasure to extend a special welcome to any new club members who are listening. We also invite you to visit the club's website for a complete listing of all Commonwealth Club events and to register for any of our future events as well. Now, we will begin our program and the official recording. Hello, and welcome to today's meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California. I am Brad Berman, your host for today's presentation. Eric Siegel is the chair of the club's Personal Growth Forum. We welcome our listening audience, and we invite everyone to visit us online at commonwealthclub.org. This presentation is free as part of the Commonwealth Club's virtual program series on the impact of COVID-19. It is generously supported by the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative and a collaborative of local funders and donors. We're grateful for their support and hope others will follow their example to support the club during these uncertain times by making a donation on our website at commonwealthclub.org. We also encourage questions from the listening audience today. Just write them down on the YouTube channel or in the comments on Facebook Live, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. And on with this evening's presentation, Managing Anxiety in the Time of COVID-19. It's a stressful time. We're understandably anxious as we face a dangerous and unprecedented situation and uncertain future. Ordinarily, we would try and cope as best we would commonly do, such as reaching out to friends and families for a supportive hug or gather together to talk things through. These are the ways we usually manage stressful situations. Yet during this time of coronavirus, we have to be physically distancing from each other. We want to make sure that our loved ones are safe, yet our presence can endanger them. We need to handle complex, unprecedented situations quickly and competently, yet our impulse may be towards panic, anxiety, and therefore avoidance. It therefore gives me great pleasure to introduce my colleague, Dr. Michael Tompkins, co-director at the San Francisco Bay Area Center for Cognitive Therapy and assistant clinical professor at the University of California, Berkeley, who specializes in the treating of anxiety disorders. Good evening, Michael.
Good evening, Brad. Nice to see you again.
It's a pleasure as always. We are fortunate that Dr. Tompkins is going to spend with us an hour sharing a few strategies that may help us to manage our anxiety more effectively. And he will also address several questions relative to this time frame in our lives and the challenges we face. Hopefully, we'll be able to address several of your own unique questions and concerns as well. And with that, Michael, please.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here, Brad, and I'm hoping that we can actually, have an informal question and answer kind of thing, and hopefully I'll have some answers that will be helpful to our listening audience.
Great, thank you. So what we decided that we would do would be to try and come up with a question and answer process here rather than just a straightforward presentation. It would be more dynamic and hopefully keep you actively engaged in this conversation. So, Michael, if I may ask, what is anxiety, fear, panic, and stress?
Well, it depends upon what you read, but for our purposes, I think we can define stress as the physiologic response to a challenge. We might define anxiety or worry as anxious apprehension. And then fear is this automatic, protective fight or flight response that we have to an imminent threat or danger. The important distinction between worry and fear is that worry has a lot more thinking in it than fear. Fear is very automatic. Worry, a lot of cognition in it. And so when, for example, if I'm walking down the sidewalk, and I hear a sound coming from the alley, I will make an evaluation. I'll have a thought. I'll have a cognition. And that thought will be perhaps threat or danger. Once that happens, I become anxious, and I have this physiologic response to that evaluation, and my body is kind of preparing itself to moderate whatever exposure I might have to this perceived threat or danger. But the operative word in worry is perhaps threat or danger.
Hmm.
So in worry, what we have is uncertainty, right? And so what we have right now is a lot of uncertainty about many, many things. And so it is natural for us all to be worrying. And one of the questions that we have on the table is like, when is this worry productive worry and when is it unproductive worry?
Can you expand a little bit further? It's interesting you phrase it that way. What does productive worry mean?
Productive worry really is about orienting us to solve a problem. And the problem, when it comes to worry, is generally a perceived threat or danger. So if you're uh, giving a big presentation tomorrow, you might start to worry. You might start to worry about your performance, and you might perceive that as a threat of not performing well. So then you will develop a plan, and it will be a preparation plan. You'll study, you might kind of rehearse it a couple of times with colleagues, you might make a PowerPoint, you'll do a number of different things. That's productive worry. Once you've done that, worry has done its job.
Hmm.
And now you can move on from worry. Unproductive worry basically is worry when there's actually no real solution, meaning you have very little influence over the outcome. If I'm preparing for a presentation, I have some influence over the outcome, meaning how well I do. But if I'm worried about the economy, I have very little influence over the economy. Right? And so what plan can I develop to solve the threat of the economy? And the answer is not much. So what happens for people who actually worry excessively is that they often engage in unproductive worry, not productive worry.
And what would be examples then of unproductive worry? Just simple things that you've seen.
Unproductive worry would be, for example, you lay down in bed at night and you start to worry about, how the company is doing. First off, you have very little influence over how the company is doing. You have a bit of influence. You have your participation in the company, but if the company includes 1,500 people and you're just one of them, while you have some influence, you don't have control. And so not only that, at 11 o'clock at night, even if there was something for you to do, you can't do it now, you can't do it then because it's 11 o'clock at night, right? And so unproductive worry really is worrying about trying to control outcomes that you have very little influence over. And one of the things the only thing that really distinguishes between normal worry versus abnormal worry, if I could use that term, is that people who worry normally or productively worry about the same things that people worry about who worry excessively. They worry about their health, they worry about money, they worry about world events, they worry about the same kinds of things. But the difference between someone who has perhaps a problem with worry is that when they're ready to stop worrying, they can't. And
Really?
so it's the controllability or perceived lack of controllability of worry, which really distinguishes it between what's, quote, normal worry and what's not normal worry.
So may be many of us in the listening audience who tend to worry more than not about particular things. So are you suggesting that it may be fallacy to think that if we just keep thinking things through over and over again, we're going to come up with the solution or the answer?
Right. That is a fallacy. It's a fallacy if your influence is very limited on an outcome. It doesn't really matter how much you worry about something or how much you plan it out. there are limits to your influence. And a lot of times what we end up doing is worrying excessively about outcomes that there's not really much we can do about. And sometimes what happens for people is the trap is that they believe worry is working on the problem. Actually, not necessarily, particularly if the problem is one that you have very little influence over. If you have very little influence over a problem, then worrying about it probably isn't going to solve the problem. Whatever you could do would solve the problem, but you can't do much because you don't have much influence over the outcome.
So if I hear you correctly, and by the way, questions are pouring in for Dr. Michael Tompkins already, a noted national and international expert on anxiety disorders and what to do about them in children, adolescents, and adults, and also the author of 12 books on the very subject. So there's a great question, and for the sake of the listening audience, I'm not going to mention anyone's name, but they are coming in this way, is how can we stop unproductive worry?
Well, there are, a number of strategies you can use to give you to learn that you do have some control of your worry process. One of the most straightforward and often recommended is kind of a scheduling worry time. So what happens if you worry excessively is that your experience is you're tending to worry all the time. And what happens when we worry a lot is worry contributes to physiologic arousal. So this is why someone with generalized anxiety disorder also has all of these somatic complaints, GI distress, headaches, muscle tension, because they're worrying a lot, and all that worry feeds into their physiology, and so they're kind of like tensed up and on edge. And so one of the ways to do it is to try to contain the worry. And one way you can do that is you can basically set several points across the day, several periods, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. And during those 5 or 10 minutes, you give yourself full permission to worry about whatever you want. All right? You just sit there and you fully worry and you engage in all your worries. But between those 5 or 10-minute windows, when you start to worry, you basically say to yourself, this is not the time I'm going to worry. I'm going to worry at 2:00, and I have that time set aside for worry. So when I'm working with people, we just schedule the worry time in their schedule into their calendar, and then they worry. But the goal is to kind of like turf the worry to one of those worry times. What that does is it does indirectly kind of contain the amount of worry. And if you contain the worry, then you're not contributing excessively to the arousal, because the arousal begets more worry. Right? And then what you can have is you can have a number of these periods over the course of the day, and as you gain more control over your worry process, you can cut out a worry period until you have very few.
Fascinating. So if hearing you, would you distinguish for a moment the difference between, our audience here, is the difference between arousal and fight or flight? Or are you really saying they're the same thing?
No, fight or flight really is, that's like with a panic attack or a fear response, that's a sudden rush of fear or terror. Sudden rush of fear or terror. I think all of us know the difference between the experience of anxiety or worry and terror. Right? So if I go back to the analogy, if I'm walking down the sidewalk and I hear a sound, I'm not really certain what that sound is. It may be danger, it may not be danger. That's why I have the thought, perhaps that's danger. However, if I turn the corner and go down the alley and someone points a gun at me, it's no longer perhaps I'm in danger. I am in danger, and what my biology will do will protect me immediately and automatically, and I won't even think about it. It will just happen, and 3 things will happen. 3 actions will happen. Either I'll escape if I can, or I'll freeze if I can't, or if there's a movement, I'll shield. Right? Those 3 things will happen automatically, and we will make that decision in an instant. And our ability to make that decision in an instant is what has contributed to our survival. But fear has very little thinking in it, because Mother Nature, in her wisdom, didn't trust us enough to say, you'll be able to make the decision about whether you're in danger or not, and you can think about that and fine. No, Mother Nature in her wisdom constituted us to act before we think when it comes to fear.
Thank you. So before we get to another excellent question about unfocused anxiety, I want to first ask you, that's what it appears like for adults, but how would this sort of arousal versus panic response appear in children or in teens?
Well, in children or even in teens, what you're going to notice is probably a lot of somatic complaints. Pediatricians are, such as yourself, Brad, are very accustomed to evaluating kids who have tummy aches or headaches or various somatic difficulties, which is due to their arousal, and that arousal is due to their worry about X, Y, or Z. Also, sleep is probably the most sensitive index of emotional well-being we have, and kids who aren't sleeping well may be worrying excessively. And then also this idea of like when kids start to regress to old behaviors that they did when they were young but have outgrown, this could signal that the kid is anxious.
Great. I'd like to come back to that. I'm writing a note for myself about that because otherwise we'll keep going down a particular path. And I'm guessing that if during this time of shelter and home stay, children are not sleeping well, it might be that parents then are also not likely to sleep as well.
Oh, I think that's fair to say that if children aren't sleeping well, that's going to be a major disruption in your sleep. And as a parent, you've had any difficulty in sleep onset and maintenance, this is the kind of scenario that's going to make it worse.
Hmm. And I know we'd like to speak a little bit more about sleep in a moment. There are two questions that I would like to merge together, and they're both excellent, which is one about feeling waves of teariness, um, something that this individual doesn't normally experience on a daily basis prior to COVID-19 and described as unfocused anxiety. And our other listener wonders about the sort of flight response when anxiety suddenly arises. And I wonder if you can discuss both of those a little bit and ways in which we could understand it and ways in which we might be able to address it.
Well, the tearfulness and emotion that comes up can come up when you're feeling really anxious or if you are in a prolonged state of stress or anxiety for an extended period of time. And also, what can happen is that if you're in a prolonged state of worry and anxiety, it can push your mood down. And so you can actually begin to feel a bit down or even depressed, particularly if you have struggled with mood in the past. And part of the reason, or one of the ways to think about this from a psychological point of view, not a biological point of view, is that with my patients, I use this analogy. It's like because anxiety is at the heart of anxiety is uncertainty. And so if I was on death row, but I didn't really know when the day was going to come in which the warden was going to come and knock at my cell and say, "Today is the day, please come with me."
Sure.
Every day I sit with not being certain about whether this is my last day or not. I get up in the morning worrying about that, thinking about that. I go to bed thinking about that. This is a sense of dread. And I think a lot of us are experiencing some dread in terms of possible outcomes. And this starts to weigh on us and push our mood down. And so, if I'm sitting on death row day after day, not really certain whether this is the last day or not, I'm going to start to feel hopeless and powerless.
Hmm.
And that's when that's going to influence my mood, because anxiety and depression, anxiety, there's still a perceived sense of control. But in depression, particularly the hopelessness, we lose that sense that we can control the outcome. When we're anxious, we're working to control the outcome, so we do believe we can do that. When we flip into believing that we have no control over the outcome, the situation becomes hopeless, and then our mood can slip.
And yet, earlier, if I heard you correctly, the suggestion is for people to let go of the belief that they can control something, like at night when they're worrying. So, what do people do if, on one hand, they're worried about circumstances that they're trying to control? On the other hand, they let up on the notion that they can control it. Would that not just flood them?
No, the answer to that, which is a recommendation I make to many people in a situation like this, is move into controlling or influencing what you have high influence over. So exercise, getting out in sunlight, with social distancing, staying to your routines, a number of things we actually do, and staying, doing your work, getting up and doing your work. Those things we have high influence over. Do those things while you try to let go of the things that you have low influence over, right? And you're practicing refocusing on the things you have high influence over, which will give you a sense of, quote, control, although I don't really believe in that word. I don't believe that we control things. I believe we have influence over things. And some things we have high influence over, and sometimes things we have low influence over, and then there's a full range. But the idea of control is a myth. It's a comforting myth, but it's a myth nonetheless.
Well, that may be an invitation for another topic in personal growth, Eric, which is about the notion control, real or fantasy.
Yeah, exactly.
So bringing it back then to the people who have asked about the unfocused anxiety, or I guess what people used to call free-floating anxiety, and then the tendency towards that panic or fight or flight. What more can they do in that moment?
One of the things that happens, I see a lot for people, and this has nothing to do with how smart a person is. What it has to do is their awareness. So a lot of times what unfocused anxiety is the person is simply not aware of the cognition. They're simply not aware of the what ifs, right? And because perhaps they've never really needed to pay attention to the what ifs, sometimes people, that's difficult for them to pay attention to what they're thinking. They're much more aware of what they're feeling or in their body or what they're doing. And so typically there isn't any such thing as unfocused anxiety. It's really about the person's not really quite aware of the what ifs that they're having that are contributing to this experience. And so the first step in cognitive therapy, of course, as you might guess,
Yes.
is to increase their awareness of the cognitions or the thoughts that are influencing their feelings.
Could you give us an example? And let's say relevant to COVID-19 or, the interventions, the politics of it, whatever it may be, but associated.
An example of what? An example of what?
Of how to bring awareness to the what ifs.
One of the easiest things to do is to journal, right? And the act of journaling is basically identifying the situation in which you started feeling anxious. And then in between the situation and the feeling of anxiety, ask yourself the question, what was going through my mind just before I started feeling that, right? Mm-hmm. And sometimes you can do hypotheses. With worry, what helps people is the term what if, because worry is uncertainty. And so look for the what ifs. So what if I get COVID? What if I lose my job? What if I'm furloughed? What if that food is contaminated? What if this? What if that? So, but journaling is probably the most straightforward way to do that.
Okay, there may be more questions that listeners ask about that. I wonder, before we move on a little bit further, if there are some strategies you might suggest in the moment when somebody is really escalating in their anxiety and or fight or flight panic
Mhm.
and moving, towards a panic attack, things like that, or it's just getting the better of them in the moment. Just so you know, some of the listeners talked about crying,
Mhm.
anger,
Mhm.
just blanking out.
Mhm. Mhm. One of the things, there are a number of things. What happens when we get in a situation like this, myself included, is that we tend to dwell on the worst possible outcomes. Right? We tend to catastrophize, and it's not that we catastrophizing is necessarily a bad thing, but we dwell on it. We dwell on the worst possible outcome. And if you look at the statistics on COVID, the likelihood of actually coming down with COVID is probably pretty low, but it doesn't feel that way. It
Right.
feels high. It feels high, right? But what happens is we dwell on the worst case scenario. So one of the things I do is I basically spend some time thinking about the best possible outcome because my anxious mind's not spending a lot of time there, right? So I try to redirect my attention to the best possible outcome. The other thing I try to redirect my attention to is successfully coping. One of the things, part of catastrophizing is underestimating one's ability to cope, our
Hmm.
ability to cope. When we underestimate our ability to cope, we can make something small into something huge, right? And so if I'm thinking about something that's really scary, I try to imagine coping with that well, or coping with that adequately, rather than, falling into the trap of dwelling on not coping with it. Um, and so that's a simple thing to do. Spend time with the best outcome, as I said. Um, think about sphere of control. Draw yourself a circle and put in the circle the things that you have high influence over. And on the outside of the circle, list all the things that you have low influence over. And then draw your attention back to the inside of the sphere and really focus your attention and energies there. I could do that, and I could do that, and I could do that. Particularly if it's around coping. There's a lot of things we can do to cope. You know, there aren't a lot of things that we can do to change the situation in the world.
Would you say that ice cream would be one of the strategies for
Ice
coping?
cream, absolutely. I just bought a nice, Ben and Jerry's quart just the other day. Absolutely.
Um, you are listening to the Commonwealth Club of California for this evening's presentation about anxiety in the time of COVID-19. We are greatly advantaged to have with us Michael Tompkins, a psychologist and expert in cognitive behavioral therapy throughout the Bay Area. So, one of the things that you and I have shared thoughts about previously is about the media diet that people have
Mhm.
been on. And I wonder if you could spend a few minutes talking about that from the viewpoint of both how it sort of may foster anxiousness and even moving towards more panic.
Yes. I have put myself on a media diet. All right. I was noticing that the more that I was drawn to media, I was drawn to news, and what draws me to news is the anxiety that comes with uncertainty. Oh, maybe I'm going to read something that's going to reassure me. Maybe I'm going to read something that's going to make me feel better in this moment. And what I realized actually, and it didn't take too much time to realize this, is that actually almost always I read something that actually made me more anxious, not less anxious. Right? And so I have decided that I'm not going to spend any more than 30 minutes reading anything on the news, no more than 30. And also, when it comes to COVID, I have limited myself to only a couple of websites, the CDC, but also the John Hopkins website is just really amazing. All right. If I want information about COVID, those are the places I go. But I don't read the news about politics, which I have all kinds of feelings about what's going on politically, so I don't read that. And so and what happens for us is that when we go on and reread those things, we actually want to read more, and so it gets harder to not read, right? But my recommendation would be put yourself on a diet, and in 3 or 4 days, you're going to notice that you don't have as strong urges to read the news. And not only that, the reading the news offers you very little in terms of what influence or what you could do to help you cope, right? Uh, Websites around coping and things like that, yes. But the news, the headlines, no.
Sure. Would you say that spending more time looking at media that we enjoy or like,
Yeah,
for example, those cat and dog videos, things like that?
that's right. Cat and dog videos are always great, right? So another thing you can do is really try to another simple thing that I recommend people do, which I do, and have been doing it for years, is I keep a gratitude journal.
Huh.
So in a situation like this, we kind of lose sight of how fortunate I am. I'll speak for myself, how fortunate I am. My worst day is better than millions of people's best day. Right? And I keep a gratitude journal, and the way to keep a gratitude journal is you don't do too much of it, but you basically reflect in your journal on a couple of things that you're grateful for. And I usually have people kind of go from their inside to their outside, which is like, I'm grateful that I can hear you. I'm grateful that I can, on my walk home, I can enjoy the gardens. They're in wonderful bloom now. I'm also grateful for my family. And one of the things that I really include in my gratitude journal a lot is my family. And I'm very grateful everyone's healthy and safe. I'm grateful I have a supportive spouse. I'm grateful I have great kids. So you just, list out some things, but don't list them. Kind of spend some time kind of describing what that experience is like for you, why it's important. Spend some time with gratitude, rather than spending time with, worry.
Thank you for that. And the listeners should know that at the end of this presentation, Dr. Tompkins will share a slide of information with us about some websites that you can go to that address themes of anxiousness and anxiety that may lead you to even further methods of support and guidance. So before we move on to something else, and then definitely want to get to children, if I hear you correctly, then you're talking about trying to organize our worries, organize our fears, and begin to separate out what's something actionable and what's not actionable,
Mhm, mhm.
and begin to let go of much more.
That's right. Another thing that helps to organize that is to focus on probability, not possibility, right? Because
Right?
anything is possible. You know?
Yes.
So looking at the CDC and trying to gather data about probability. If I organized my life relative to all the possible bad things that could happen to me on any particular day, I would never leave my bed, which would diminish my effectiveness in life. The reason we're effective as organisms is that we organize our actions relative to probability,
Mm.
not possibility. Right? And this is really important when you start thinking about how you spend your day. Years ago, I love this story. Years ago, I was working, my wife and I were doing this big remodel and we were adding a second floor. We were working with this wonderful architect. And the architect said, we're going to have to bring a structural engineer in here because we're adding this and we need to actually, get some expertise in terms of how to support the structure so that it's safe. But the architect said, but let me just tell you a little bit about structural engineers. And if there are any structural engineers in the audience tonight, I apologize. But the architect said, look, this is the way structural engineers work. The safest structure is a box without windows and doors. That's the safest place to live. But the architect said, but do you really want to live in a box with no windows and doors? Do you really want to live in a box that without sunshine? Do you really want to live in a box that you can't leave? Because every time you add a window and a door to your structure, you add a little bit more risk. And I listened to this architect as a psychologist and I said, she's brilliant, because that is a metaphor for how to live a life fully. You know, that trying to live a life without windows and doors may lower your risk, but is it really the way you want to live your life? I don't want to live my life that way. So I organize my actions relative to likelihood, to probability, but I recognize that life always has risks. And that is, what makes life, at the end of the day, actually worth living, you know? That it fulfills us when we take on a risk or a challenge and we go for it. So I really try to organize my actions relative to this metaphor.
That's a wonderful story. Thank you for that, Michael.
Mhm.
So before we move to children, one last question, and then I promise some of the listeners and Michael that at the end we'll save a little bit of time to talk about sleep.
Mhm.
And so the specific question, which I thank the listener for, is what might you suggest related to people whose job it is to either read the news or be
Mhm.
involved in an industry that has to pay attention to that? And more specifically, if they are involved with, I'll say loosely, the COVID-19
Mhm.
healthcare providers and so on, first responders.
So it sounds like the question is, I can't, my job is to read the news.
Yes. Or to be involved with COVID-19 every waking moment you're
Every
involved.
waking moment, maybe you're a physician planning response or something like that. So you're involved in
Yes.
this. I think that probably the best thing that one could do in a situation like that would be to make sure that you have a really good self-care plan and you're following it. Right? That at the end of the day, you're spending a lot of time with all the bad things that could happen, and there are a lot of bad things that could happen. And I would say we're all kind of like experiencing all the bad things that could happen, but to actually have that in your face all day, I think would be really hard. And so I would be, if it were me, I would be making sure that I have that the time I'm away from that, I am really taking care of myself. I'm exercising, I'm getting out, I'm spending time with my loved ones to the degree I can. If I start to worry, I'm going to use some of these strategies we've talked about today. I'm going to avoid, uh, uh, drinking too much alcohol, too much caffeine. I'm going to really try to take care of myself. And that actually sounds easier said than done many times, because a lot of times when we're really worried and anxious, we get so swept up in the experience that we actually lose sight of the fact that there are some things that we could do to help ourselves cope in this moment. But make it a priority.
Thank you. Thank you. Very, very unique and difficult situation for sure. So let's talk for a moment about children and teens, because there are many parents asking questions in our listening audience tonight. So you mentioned that children and adolescents do show anxiety, and I know you just mentioned a few. Um, what are some of the ways that you might suggest that parents can help, specifically around the whole relationship of remaining at home right now, not being able to go out, see their friends, go to
Mhm.
school,
Absolutely.
observing media and so on? What are some of the strategies and techniques that parents can use to support their children?
Yes, I am so sympathetic for parents right now who are sheltered in place with little ones. My kids, I have two daughters, they're young adults now. I I have neighbors who have little ones. So we have teddy bears on our windows like all our neighbors. Um, I just can't imagine that, actually. It's hard enough. And then the parents are trying to kind of like basically homeschool their kids. I mean, it's overwhelming. It's overwhelming. But what can you do with your kids if your kid is over anxious? There are a couple of things you can do. You can provide information that's appropriate to their developmental age. And so when your kids come to you with questions, try to answer those questions in a straightforward, honest way, but don't provide more information than they're asking, right? Another thing you can do is you can teach kids you can teach them what are called somatic arousal, strategies. So you can teach them belly breathing. Make it a game. In my office, I have a little piece of blue felt. I have a rubber ducky. When the little kid comes in, I put it on their tummy, and I ask them to give the ducky a gentle ride on their belly. Right? So teach them to breathe belly. Teach them to relax intense. Do progressive muscle relaxation. With little ones, you're going to just do a few. You're not going to do 12 groups, but tighten this part, tighten the gut, and tighten the legs. The other thing is that if your kid is really worrying a lot, you can have the kid give the worry a name.
Mm-hmm.
So like the worry bully or some bad actor, so that now you can talk about the worry with some distance from it. So it's not about the kid, it's really about this thing. And then you can teach the kid to kind of like boss back the worry. I often play a game of like red light, green light, in my office, where I'm the big bad worry bully, and the kid turns around and I sneak up on the kid, and then the kid turns around and bosses me back. So, and the last thing you can do or not do is to remember that one of the things that happens with kids, but can happen to all of us, is don't confuse your kids' anxiety that they may be pushing back on you, but because they're anxious. They're not bad kids. They are actually really anxious, and not confuse a tantrum necessarily with that they don't want to do this or they don't want to do with that. They may be very overwhelmed in that moment, and it may not be easy for them to do what you're asking. And so treating it as oppositional behavior, it can be a problem.
That's a great point, and it would be beyond the time frame of this conversation this evening to delve into how you tell the difference more. But are you suggesting that children also may feel more worried or anxious as they feel the worry or anxious in their parents?
Yeah, I think that, one of the things to keep in mind is that if you're a parent and you run a little anxious, you want to be careful that you're not worrying aloud. Because if you're worrying aloud, meaning you're just worrying and you're talking about your worry, and you have little ones, kiddos around, what you're doing is modeling something about the world, which may not be helpful to your children. I think instead what you want to model is coping. That's what you want to model. You want to reassure your kids and say, this will pass. We've been through hard things before. Let's talk about how we can help you get through the next couple of days and work out a coping plan for kids. The last thing about kids, and this is true for all of us, and it's probably relevant when we get to sleep, is that you want to help your kids maintain their routines as much as possible. Those routines will ground your child, in the same way that when, toddlers wanted to, when story time came, they often want the same story over and over again, because that same story is reassuring for them. And you try to introduce a different story, they don't want to do that. And so young kids in particular benefit from routine. And so to the degree possible, try to maintain the routine. But again, I'm going to say is that, when both adults are working from home and you have little ones, that's easier said than done. But try to strive for that. And the other thing is routine really is one of the ways that we influence our uh, circadian clock, and that will influence our sleep. And this is particularly true for teens, because now teens are free to follow their clock, many times, which is okay. It will give the teen and you a real good idea of what their true clock is, right? But even then, you want them to try to maintain a standard lights out time and standard get out of bed time, whatever their clock determines in this particular time.
Sure. No, thank you and appreciate that. Back to a question that I'm presuming a mother had asked, which is, would you give a few thoughts about how you help young children, before we get to adults, 3 to 8-year-olds, 3 to 9-year-olds, in terms of sleep difficulties at this time? And I don't mean the routine ones, but I mean ones that have, popped up since all of this has happened.
Um, if what you're going to want to, some of the things you're going to strive for is you're going to try to help your kid stay in bed. Is the first thing. Help your kid stay in bed. Right? So it's much easier in the evening. So when you do story times, do story time in your kid's bed, not story time in the big bed. When my kids were little, we would do story time in the big bed, and we would have watermelon and story time. But at this particular time, if your kids are anxious, you want to do story time in their bed. And the reason is it's a lot easier for you to get out of their bed than it is for you to take your kid from your bed to their bed, because the likelihood your kid's going to awaken during that transport is high.
Sure.
All right. The other things that you want to do is you want to kind of like teach them some strategies at bedtime to cope. You can set up a reward system. One of the ones that I like the best is that I call Connect the Dot, which is basically having a big reward, getting a silhouette of that reward, putting it on graph paper, and where the drawing touches the graph paper, put a dot. And each dot represents a reinforcer. And so ideally, when the kid connects all the dots, they get the big reward, but in between every third dot, they get a small reward. And so now you have a reward system to help them kind of like stay in bed. And so you could have them stay in bed, or you could reward them for when you return them to bed, they come to you and you return them to bed, that they return to bed with grace and no pushback, and they get rewarded for that. And then basically emphasize, coping strategies for them.
Sure.
Reassure them, do what you're doing, hug them, and redirect them. And again, naming the worry bully can be helpful to externalize their worry for them.
Mhm. Michael, that dot to dot and little reward and big reward sounds actually kind of fun, like for
Yeah, it
adults
is
as well.
It is fun.
So can we segue then? Maybe we should be doing that with adults that are having a hard time sleeping right now.
Well, I think that if we go to sleep in general,
Yes.
the way to think about sleep is that there are three drivers. Well, first off, the problem is that if you have struggled with insomnia, this time is probably really hard. If you kind of like semi-managed your insomnia over the years, this time is going to be really hard for you. There are three systems that feed into sleep. One is the arousal system. I think all of us can agree that we have a lot of physical and mental arousal. Physical and mental arousal keeps sleep away. Okay? The other process is what's called the sleep drive system. This is our drive to sleep. This is our appetite for sleep. This is so we all know what that's like. When you're sitting up and you start to feel that sleep pressure, this pressure to sleep, that's sleep drive. The other is the biologic or the circadian clock, which works kind of like in tandem with sleep drive. So what happens when we start to have sleep problems, we basically start to change our behavior to try to sleep more.
Mhm.
When we try to sleep more or produce more opportunity for sleep, what happens is that we drain sleep drive. Sleep drive is our friend. What we really want to do is to optimize sleep drive. So that's why we say no naps. No naps, no matter how tired you are. Because if you take a nap, that basically drains your sleep tank, which is your sleep drive tank.
Right.
We 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 recommend staying to a lights out, get out of bed time. And it doesn't really matter what those times are, so long as they're consistent. And that consistency helps with our clock, but also helps with our sleep drive. Don't stay in bed if you're not asleep, trying to produce more sleep. Because if you do nap or kind of like nap in that state, you're basically driving down your sleep drive. The other thing that really is influencing all of us right now is our clocks, because our clocks are really influenced by routine. And a lot of us don't have the same routines that we did, even a few months ago. And routine kind of like routine entrains our circadian clock. It entrains our mood. It entrains a lot of things. So, for example, routine, like eating meals at the same time. Now you might find your mealtime shifting around for whatever reason. Try not to do that. Try to go adhere to a standard dinner time, a standard breakfast time, a standard lunch time. If you're working from home, your lunch times might have gotten a little, wiggly. Get back to a standard routine. That all feeds back into the clock. Try to maintain socialization. Socialization affects clock, right? So when we're working with someone with chronic insomnia, we're really trying to target those three systems. And then the arousal system is some of the things we've talked about, of like relaxation, meditation, things like that to dampen your arousal, thinking strategies to help your arousal, but trying to make sure you don't stay in bed when you're not asleep.
Say that again, please.
Making sure you don't stay in bed when you're not asleep.
Okay, great. So we have about 5-6 minutes left. Would you say one quick word, therefore, about screens in bed and sleep, even if you can filter out blue wavelength light?
Blue wavelength light, the evidence is not strong about its contribution to arousal, right? But it's really about content. It's about content, right? So so I would never read the news just before bed. If I want to get my arousal system going, read the news just before bed. I'm not going to do that, right? The other thing is, don't do any other activity other than the 3 S's: sleep, sick, and sex. That's it. Don't do any other activities, because what happens when you do other activities that are arousal, this really interesting thing happens. Pavlovian classical conditioning, which means that when we're engaged in an activity that's arousing and we're in bed, our minds start to link bed with arousal. So now when we get into bed, boom, bing, our minds are turned on. So this is another reason, like, don't do anything other than those 3 S's in bed. And when you're not asleep, get up out of bed. Because if you stay in bed awake, what you're doing is conditioning your mind to be awake. And every mother knows how this works. Because if you're a mother and you were nursing, your mind probably awakened a few minutes before your baby cried if you had a standard nursing time. Your mind was conditioned to awaken. That's what happens when you stay in bed awake.
Wonderful. That's fascinating. Thank you so much for that. So last question before we begin to fade out this evening's presentation is, when should we worry, and when might you recommend that people begin to seek professional guidance or counsel?
It's a terrific question. there's a difference between anxiety and anxiety disorder. And all the disorder means is that it's like these 4Ds. One is your anxious response is disproportionate to the objective threat or danger, right? So you're not just anxious, you are super panicky anxious, all right? Most of your friends and colleagues probably aren't having panic attacks. If you're having panic attacks, you're having a disproportionate emotional response to the situation. The second D is distress. The anxiety itself is very distressing for you. You're losing sleep, you can't think about anything else, you're preoccupied, you're having trouble focusing on your work, distressed. The third D is disruptive, meaning that actually your anxiety, and often it's avoidance, has disrupted your life. You know, you're not doing things that you used to do. You are finding it hard to work. You're finding it hard to maintain your typical routines. And the fourth D is duration, which is that we all have anxious responses to events, but typically our systems calm down within 6 months. If you are still really, you have these other 3Ds in play for longer than 3 months, it's probably an anxiety disorder. So the goal of treatment is to actually remove the 4Ds so that the disorder disappears, but the anxiety doesn't disappear because anxiety is normal. So when you, the other thing is, if you have struggled with an anxiety disorder in the past, you probably are having a worsening of your symptoms. That would be the time to actually go back to your therapist, work with an anxiety specialist to get some help. And it may be the time to talk with your psychiatrist or your physician about medication, particularly if you're not sleeping well. But I really would recommend those who are thinking about help to think about working first with, a therapist who's an experienced anxiety disorder specialist.
Thank you. So this would be a great time to show that slide, please.
I'll do that. I would say that we will get through this, and we will get through this together, and we will learn some things that will help us be better prepared for this should it happen again. And I think this is the time for us to reach out to each other, to be patient with each other, to lean on each other while we wait for this to pass.
Thank you for those just wonderful words and the feelings behind it. And we are ever so grateful. We are also grateful to our live listening audience, as well as those who will access this recording at another time. And now, this meeting of the Commonwealth Club of California, commemorating its 116th year of enlightened discussion, is adjourned.